You're listening to HR Leader, inspiring you to lead the workforce of tomorrow.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the HR Leader podcast. My name's Jerome Doraisamy, and I'm coming to you today from Camaragal Land in Sydney. I'm very pleased to be joined for this conversation in the studio by David Field, who is the Director of People and Finance at Canon Oceania. David, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Jerome.
Now, David and I also know each other in a personal capacity. We both serve as board directors for the Minds Count Foundation, which aims to raise awareness of and hopefully stamp out the prevalence of psychological distress, anxiety and depression in the legal profession and across all sectors. David, today you and I are going to be discussing how best businesses across the country can be rethinking return to the office mandates, and in particular, how your business, Canon, has looked to imbibe volunteering and team building activities as part of those RTO mandates. So I'm really keen to learn a bit more about the state of affairs with RTOs across the country and how best businesses can be thinking outside the box, what's going to work and what may not work in the current climate. David, before we get into all of that, let's talk a little bit about you and your journey. Would you mind telling our listeners a bit about yourself and the work that you do at Canon?
So I was trained as a lawyer, as you know. I worked in private practice as a lawyer. I worked at Telstra for 19 years, in-house as a lawyer, and was originally recruited to Canon almost 9 years ago, as the chief legal counsel and also the head of quality, sustainability and environment. That role has evolved over time. Probably, let me just say, when I started, the SLT at Canon Oceania was 12 people. The SLT at Canon Oceania today is 7 people, and I guess there's been a consolidation of roles in that process. I think coming into this conversation, I was thinking about that and how it happens, and I think probably. I think there's a very natural evolution of roles for people in, professional or technical areas where I think early in your career it is very much about the technicalities and probably you're much more of a technician. But as you evolve into a manager, leader, executive, it becomes, sort of less about the technicalities and actually more about things like purpose, strategy, values, risk, things like that. And, to a large extent, what you're doing at the executive level really is about sort of putting that overlay on so much of the technicalities, whether it is law, whether it is HR, whether it is finance, and so often in law there's a for lawyers, for junior lawyers, it's often about what can I do, what's legal. And as you evolve in your career, and particularly in an in-house context, you realize what can I do is only a tiny part of the question. It's actually what should I do? I might be able to do this. I might be allowed to do this. Should I do this? Is this the right thing to do? Is this actually who I am? Does this reflect my values? And that very much comes through with people, as you can imagine, all the time. And there's obviously a very strong, detailed, technical, legal background to the employment framework as well. But also so much of it really is about values and culture. And that's really, I guess what you come to be bringing at the executive level as a leader.
On a personal level, how have you found that transition and evolution from being a technical specialist as a lawyer to taking that sort of broader, what I might crudely term, bigger picture focus to business?
Yeah, I think I'd already made that evolution, very, quite a long time ago in my legal career. I guess as you advance, as you progress through your career, you find yourself, sort of further and further from the technical detail. You find yourself further and further from the, from being on the tools. You do find that, with technical people, with their training, and no disrespect, it's the way we're trained. It is very much about, the law says this or the contract says this. So quite early, I think in my career evolution, in leadership, in law, you do learn that's only a small part of the answer. I think as that process starts, as that growth starts, it's unnerving. I think for technical professionals, that knowledge of but the contract says this or the law says that, that's comforting. That's a real sort of security blanket, and they just sort of go back to that and gravitate to that. But as you progress, you actually need to let go of that security blanket, and I think particularly as you become as you come to lead a function or functions. Initially, it can be quite scary to be that far away from the detail and actually, to be managing directions, to be managing strategy, to be managing, sort of overarching outcomes. And it is unnerving that actually, necessarily you have, significant blind spots in the breadth of things that you're covering. And that is initially unnerving, particularly when you've got that, very detailed technical training as a lawyer. But that's life, and I think so much of leadership is about really what really matters here. What are the key issues? What's going to be okay? What can we put in the 80% on? What do we have to get right?
Absolutely. Now, turning our attention to return to the office mandates, I want to start with a very broad question. What's your perception of the state of affairs for Australian businesses, bringing their staff back to the office after the years of the pandemic? Do you feel or get the sense that businesses are going about things the right way? Are they forcing people back against their will? Have they taken too long to bring people back to the office? What's your general sense of how businesses are acting on this front?
Very good question. And interestingly, it throws back to the topic that we were just discussing, where, if I look at people are so ambiguous, in so many ways. There are no perfectly right answers. And I think that our economy, our society is still feeling its way through this issue. When I think about COVID and the pandemic, I think that a factor that I saw was that the pandemic accelerated a lot of trends that were already there, in the background, and just really, sort of compressed change. It was very, very rapid, very, sort of jarring in a lot of ways. So I think the working from the office has always been the traditional way of doing things, but sort of COVID helped to break that and make us look at, okay, so why? And people got very, very used to working from home and sort of not having to put on office clothes, not have to do a commute, not have to come in. And so it's been very hard to sort of reaccustom people to coming back in the office. And I don't think there is a 100% right answer here. It is ambiguous. I think aspects of it are cultural in relation to what sort of organisation are you, and how do your people work together. I think there are very clear benefits to flexibility and working from home, but also at the same time there are very clear benefits to being in the same place together. And I think it's going to be very cultural and probably culture-driven and values-driven in relation to what sort of organisation are you. How do you place yourself on that sort of spectrum of possible approaches to this?
Just zooming out a little bit, part of the reason I was so interested to have this conversation with you is to unpack why it is important to bring people back to the office, if indeed it is important. As you'll be well aware, there is a disconnect of sorts between employers and employees as to the extent to which people should be brought back into the office, if at all. And that disconnect is somewhat generational. The older workers, and I'll include myself in that boat, having worked in the
office, you're younger than me, Jerome.
Having worked in offices pre-pandemic, we understand the traditional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday vibe, whereas a lot of younger workers, such as graduates who started their careers in the pandemic, they knew working from home as the norm. And for the older folk, they are saying it's really important to have the water cooler conversations, have the incidental learning opportunities to build culture and camaraderie in a team environment. And the younger folk saying, well, I was getting the job done from home, so what's the problem? And neither of those two camps are necessarily wrong. So how can we define whether or not it's right to bring people back into the office or not?
Yes, I think in a lot of ways you've basically reflected back to me the ambiguity that I'm talking about there, and it will be cultural, and maybe that's why there is no single right answer. It depends on your organisation, your work, your workforce. If I can put it this way, I think there is a risk that the older generation basically just says, no, this has all gone too far. The natural and right thing to do is work from the office. Everyone should come back into the office. And that's not enough of an answer. Just because that's the way we always used to do it, that's not a good enough answer. Yeah. And a great expression that I heard is, which I really take to heart, is, to earn the commute. Yeah. And while I struggle with some of the aspects around what that means exactly to earn the commute, I think it's a great mindset. Because it says, don't just say you're coming back into the office, that's the end of it. Yeah. Think about why. Yeah. What is it that happens here that you can do better than what you do at home? And I think there might not be perfect answers around that, but that's the right place to be reaching for.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way to put it. David, what you were just touching on really goes nicely to my next question, which is, I guess, really understanding the why. The why you are bringing people back to the office. It is obviously a bit too cynical to just say that businesses want to bring people back because they've got to pay their commercial rent. There are, of course, good reasons to bring people back in, and communicating them is going to be critical. So my guess is that a good starting point here is to perhaps ask some fundamental questions or philosophical questions of your business and why it is so important to bring people back in. Do you agree that that is a good starting point?
Yeah, I probably just throwing back to that expression, earn the commute. I think, if you've got that mindset, that will help you in how you think about it and help you in how you communicate to people. You touched on, the water cooler conversations. The way I think about that is, I've sort of heard it called the coincidental interactions or the incidental interactions, or some people call it the collisions. Yeah. For me, it's this the serendipitous meetings, the serendipitous interactions, and what I've found with everyone working from home, and it's all Teams meeting after Teams meeting after Teams meeting or Zoom meeting, your day is very planned and linear. Yep. And I don't think that is totally a good thing. I think that leads to a fairly narrow focus on what it's about, and in some ways potentially a very self-centered and somewhat insular approach to what your job should be about, and what you need to know and what you need to do. And it really struck me, I think, in sort of having people coming back into the office, that really refreshing feeling of bumping into someone you haven't seen for, a colleague you haven't seen for a month or a couple of months, and saying, oh, what are you up to? What's happening? And it's actually really interesting what you learn about the business. I think, any complex modern business is actually just too big for one individual to really actually understand and hold in their head. There'll always be, you've got a model of what you think is happening, but you will always learn more from talking about the people who are actually out doing it. Yeah. And so, you always learn more about your business. And, so when, and probably, I think also to the point around, I at one stage at Telstra, I had a role that was primarily in Melbourne, with a team primarily in Melbourne. I was based in Sydney, and I would go down for, a few days a fortnight. And what really struck me was that, there's a threshold of things that will lead to you picking up the phone or you calling, you getting on a Teams call or them getting on a Teams call. There's a whole heap of really interesting and valuable things below that threshold that don't justify it, but are still, part of the rich, sort of experience, the rich sort of total picture of what's happening in an organisation. When you're there with someone, you can hear their tone of voice. You can see their body language. You can hear the conversations that they're having with the business. You can, understand there's an issue in relation to, the stress that they're under in relation to particular conversations, or you can, sort of hear how particular issues are being dealt with in a way that you would never see in a report or never see in a catch up once a week.
Still on this point about earning the commute, do you think that we also need to be interpreting this in a literal sense, or reading it in a black letter sense, by way of appreciating the financial or economic constraints that many employees will have who are still in a cost of living crisis and paying to come into the office, on the train or on the bus, there and back, potentially having to buy your lunch as well. All of those little costs add up. So, do businesses need to be thinking about the economic factors for their staff in asking them to come back in more days?
I guess I'm wary of that in relation to a almost like a sort of a sense of entitlement that can creep in there in relation to, now I need to wear different clothes, or I need to get on a bus, or so I can't have toasted sandwiches at home. Yeah. And that becomes, you need to compensate me for that. I don't think that's the right approach.
Okay.
But I do think it's important that you view it in terms of the total employment value proposition. These are clearly things that your people value, and sort of having that in the mix, I think is important. So it's not so much from the compensation side, but it's something that your employees value, and a degree of flexibility there is absolutely something that your employees are going to value, and that should be a part of the total value proposition.
So at Canon, how have you answered some of these questions? How have you looked to define or redefine that employee value proposition? How have you looked to ensure that you have earned the commute from the staff?
I think a lot of it really is around how are you using people's time in the office. It doesn't make any sense to drag people in from their homes just to spend their time with their headphones on in front of a screen doing a Teams meeting there and in the office. I could have done that from home. And, there is absolutely richer conversation that happens when you're face-to-face in a meeting. There is body language. There is, sort of more nuance. It's less linear. And so, there's a cultural thing there around actually encouraging the meetings to happen together. If you're all in the office, you should be making it happen together because that is richer. We had an interesting issue with one of our sort of large projects that we were doing where there were issues with a particular team that sort of developed a lot of dissatisfaction around not really understanding how it meant, not understanding what it meant, not understanding how they fitted in, not understanding, what was being done, not understanding, in some respects, the strategic objectives, the value judgments that had been made in relation to, sort of how well it needed it to be done. I actually attribute a lot of that to probably a real culture of people just wanting to work from home, because and interestingly, people don't necessarily seem to see that point of I can get my job done at home. I just want to work from home. Oh, no one told me about this. No one told me about that. And that's not a cop out for leaders. When you do have a team working remote or working sort of hybrid, working in different locations, you do need to make sure you're taking the time to fill that communication void. But at the same time, it's a two-way street. I think making sure that the team is coming together, making sure that you're having the conversations if you think there are gaps, making sure that you're flagging them, grabbing the chance to talk in the office rather than we come into a different location, we're wearing different clothes, we've paid money, to commute in, and now we're all just going to go away and, act as though we were still, in our, at a kitchen table at home.
Yeah. With your own approach at Canon then, have you undertaken a bit of trial and error or experimentation when it comes to finding the right balance, or I guess understanding the secret sauce to, ensuring that the business gets what it needs from its staff in person versus ensuring that everyone is happy and fulfilled coming into the office?
So we last year moved to our approach essentially is a hybrid approach, and we've actually everybody in the organisation has a hybrid rating, and that's really based on can your job be done remotely? If it can't be done remotely, you're a hybrid 5 for the number of days you have to come in. If you're a people manager, then your hybrid rating is now 4. You're supposed to come in 4 days a week. If you're an individual contributor and your job can be done remotely, your hybrid rating is 3.
Okay.
And so you need to come to the office 3 days a week. And we increased all of those days by 1 day last year, and that's I think probably going back to a theme that we've sort of had in this conversation is I think there is no right perfect answer.
Okay.
And it is cultural, and sort of just tweaking the settings, adjusting the settings, I think is very important. Watching, learning, listening. So I'm pleased with the the degree of flexibility. I think as part of our employee value proposition, our employees absolutely value that opportunity to be able to work from home.
Yeah.
But culturally, for us, it is important to have our people coming in.
Yeah.
I think sort of throwing back to that point I was making about that particular team where they were feeling disconnected and had real issues around no one tells us anything what's happening. Well, are you coming in? Are you listening? Are you paying attention? Are you engaging in conversations? Are you talking about what you're not understanding? I think a really important point here is probably the sense of team.
Yeah.
I think that's really critical. I think it's a lot harder to forge that sense of identity and that sense of team and maybe that sense of trust. I think when people are working remotely and all of their interactions are very, very, there was a purpose for this call rather than we bumped into each other and we're shooting the breeze. I think increasingly where I'm going is a sense that much of what people actually work for and much of actually what people feel connected to is the team. And I've been thinking about this in relation to, if you go to war, are you fighting for your country or actually are you fighting for your mates? In a sporting team, are you playing for your country? Notionally, yes. But actually, the people you most don't want to let down is your mates, is your team. And, I think that sense of, being around each other, interacting with each other, knowing a bit more about each other beyond the corporate facade, is so important to foster that deeper communication and that trust.
I want to follow up on that point with you, and we'll get to that on the other side of this. So, David, how can businesses and certainly their leaders be looking to foster that sense of team? When asking staff to return to the office, I think a lot of businesses and team leaders will have fallen back on certain activities that will have worked in years gone by. Friday drinks, up at the pub with everyone, or maybe you'll pay for lunch for everyone, or yoga classes, boot camp, whatever. How have you looked to foster that sense of team in this new normal post-pandemic? And of course, noting also that we now have, more generations in the workforce than ever before, and what constitutes team for one generation may be very different to another generation. So how have you looked to go about that?
Yeah, a particular area where we've been focusing, I think, is really about purpose and common purpose and shared activities around purpose. So, a big focus for us has been our, community programs. So we have a number of partnerships with a number of different community organisations, and a real focus for us on that is the opportunities that they bring for our people and the opportunities for team activities together. I think so many people these days, and particularly the younger generations, sort of want an organisation that they feel is aligned with their sense of identity, their sense of purpose, and their sense of who they are. And it's very valuable to be able to use employment relationship, and the community at work to give them that chance to to contribute to society and do things that are meaningful and and rewarding, and then together, which is great. So when we look for community partnerships, for example, the Smith family, we've got a very, very strong relationship with an orphanage in the Philippines. And these sorts of organisations give us an opportunity to actually do things together. In New Zealand, I've Got Your Backpack, which, for example, includes things like actually the team going together and packing backpacks for people, fleeing homelessness or domestic violence. With the Smith family, actually, going off-site and together, working through, digital checking for children's safety and things like that. These sorts of activities reinforce people's sense of who they are, reinforce their sense that the organisation does care about the community. We've the underlying philosophy of Canon is it's a Japanese expression called kyosei, which is normally translated as living and working together for the common good. But fundamentally, the two words in Japanese are sort of shared life, and it's about this sense that no organisation can actually survive without due regard for the community that it operates within, and fundamentally, you cannot profit at the expense of the community within which you are a fundamental part. And so that sort of kyosei philosophy flows through, so much of our messaging, so much of what we try to do, and so much of who we try to be. And so we're always using that as a touchstone in relation to the community partnerships and the community giving.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I guess in a nutshell, that idea of fostering a sense of community, working towards a bigger purpose, working for the greater good together, and of course individually as well, that you have found has reaped greater benefit for the business longer term, rather than having, I guess, what you could term gimmicks, like your Friday afternoon drinks.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it has a, as I see it, I believe it has a profound effect on the people who actually participate. But then there's also something of a halo effect even around the people who don't participate, because they see the messaging, they see the photos, they see the photos of their team members, and also gives them a sense of who is this organisation that I work for? What does it do? What does it mean? So it's profoundly beneficial when you're part of that team that's gone off site and done this thing, and you spent your time giving, and that's sort of helped in terms of your sense of the alignment between the organisation and you, but then also the people who watch or hear about it. That's also good for them.
Yeah, and I suppose to that end, it's not just about telling people you have a good culture; it's about living a good culture.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. I think probably, particularly in this day and age, we've got so much information, washing over us, and everybody's, sort of desperately trying to look for, well, what are the key things I need to focus on? So, for it to be impactful, it needs to be something that's meaningful, that it's going to make people stop and say, that's interesting.
Yeah. So what would be your advice to business leaders across the country about how they can, rethink their return to the office mandates and ensure that they are imbibing that sense of community? Whether they're a big firm or a small business, what are the first practical steps to be taken, or the questions to be asked of oneself?
Yeah, I think, as I said, it is cultural, and I think that means there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all. So I think you do need to think about your workforce. You need to think about who you are. There may be businesses that have been, have no offices. There are businesses that have no offices, and in that situation, I'm sure those organisations are already thinking about, what does it mean to be part of the team? How do they foster those communications? If they're not, they certainly should be. In that sort of remote setting. For the rest of us, I think it is it is so important to be focused on the fact that the flexibility is part of the employee value proposition, and to be thinking about how you provide that, and I think that mindset of have I earned the commute. I think exactly how you do it, that's a difficult question. But that philosophy, that mindset is so important. Yeah. I can't just sit there and say, you must come back. I must think about why. What do I think is here that's important? What can you do here that you can do better than you could have done at home? I think having that in the back of your mind is critically important, because otherwise you can fall just into without a need to. I guess you've now got a young child, so that as children sort of get to that age, with early language around everything is why, and sometimes you find yourself as a parent saying that's not a why question. So the risk is that businesses think that a return to office mandate isn't a why question. It's not negotiable. I think you do need to stay humble in relation to have I earned the commute? Yeah. What am I doing here? I don't think you'll ever solve it perfectly, but it's critical that you keep asking yourself about what is it that I'm offering here that can be done better here? What more am I getting out of it? What more are you getting out of it?
Yeah. I love that. I think that's a perfect place for us to finish. David Field, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jerome. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to the listener for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please give us a rating and review on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts, as it'll help other professionals discover and enjoy this show. We'll see you again next time.